The sharp wind clawed at the faces of the four explorers as they stood before the cave entrance, its gaping mouth framed by jagged rocks and patches of stubborn frost. The villagers had called it Sighing Hollow, warning that the winds that bled from its depths carried curses whispered by the ancient dead. To the group, it was just another legend to unravel. Eric, the group leader, adjusted his headlamp, his movements deliberate and calm. "This is it, the source of the anomaly," he said, his tone clipped. His blue eyes flickered to the others, challenging their resolve. Beside him, Katia, the scientist, was busy scanning the cave's entrance with her portable spectrometer. Her breath fogged the air as she muttered, "Readings are off the charts. Higher carbon dioxide levels than expected. If there's a geological explanation, we'll find it." Milo, the skeptic, lit a cigarette, the orange glow cutting through the encroaching twilight. "It's just a cave. Spooky, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. I'll bet we'll find an old miner's stash and call it a day." His voice carried the strained confidence of someone attempting to hide his unease. Then there was Hannah, the newcomer. She was younger than the others, her rucksack packed with more than she could carry, and her wide eyes betrayed both excitement and fear. She had barely spoken since they arrived. "All right," Eric said, breaking the silence. "Double-check your gear. Once we're in, no one goes wandering off." His gaze lingered on Hannah. "Stay close." The cave swallowed the daylight as they stepped inside, their headlamps throwing jittery cones of light against the stone walls. Almost immediately, the group noticed it, the sound, a low, rhythmic hiss, like the exhalation of some massive, slumbering beast. The sound resonated through the cavern, faint at first, but undeniable. "Just air currents," Katia said, though her voice quivered slightly. She stopped to examine a cluster of ancient carvings on the wall, spirals and crude humanoid figures arranged in a chaotic tableau. These they weren't on the preliminary survey photos. Looks like something added them later. The further they descended, the more oppressive the cave became. The air thickened, stifling their breath, and the temperature plummeted. The rhythmic hiss grew louder, accompanied now by faint whispers that seemed to drift just out of reach. Milo snorted. "Nice acoustics. Bet someone carved those symbols to sell ghost stories to idiots like us." "No one's been down here in decades," Eric snapped, his patience wearing thin. Hannah stopped abruptly, clutching at Eric's sleeve. "I thought I saw something," she whispered. "What?" Eric asked, shining his beam into the darkness. The shadows danced, but there was nothing there. "Nothing," Hannah murmured, her cheeks flushing. "Sorry, just nerves." But as they pressed deeper, each of them began to feel it, a presence. The shadows seemed to writhe and recoil from their lights, forming shapes that vanished the moment they tried to focus on them. When they came to a narrow passage, Eric stopped. "This is where it gets tricky. Stick close. No one falls behind." "Sounds like a great place to turn back," Milo muttered, but the group pressed on. As they squeezed through the tunnel, the whispers grew louder, each syllable distinct now, though in a language none of them recognized. The hissing exhalations reverberated through the stone, as if the cave itself were alive. When the passage finally opened into a larger chamber, Katia froze. "God," she whispered, pointing at the walls. The chamber was covered in inscriptions, far more detailed than the crude carvings from before. Depictions of hooded figures surrounding a central figure, a humanoid shape with elongated limbs and gaping holes where eyes should be. Beneath it, hundreds of smaller figures knelt, their heads bowed in supplication. "Sacrifices," Eric said grimly, running his hand along the wall. Katia nodded. This could be a record of ancient rituals. But why here? And why? Before she could finish, the chamber shook violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the sound of exhalation grew deafening. "Did you feel that?" Hannah whispered. "Feel what?" Eric asked, his voice sharp. Hannah's eyes widened. "The walls, they moved," Milo scoffed. But his laughter faltered as the ground beneath them seemed to shudder, like a beast stirring from slumber. And then the hissing stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute, suffocating. Then the whispers returned, louder, closer, wrapping around them like unseen hands. As the whispers surged, their voices entwined in a cacophony of unrecognizable syllables, the four explorers stood frozen in the chamber. The inscription seemed alive now, the humanoid figures on the walls subtly shifting their positions under the erratic beams of the headlamps. "I'm hearing words," Katia murmured, her voice strained. "Don't listen to it," Eric barked, snapping his fingers in front of her face. "Focus. It's just air movement and psychological tricks. Let's move deeper. We came here for answers, not ghost stories." But Milo wasn't buying it. He pressed his back to the wall, shaking his head. "Deeper? Are you kidding me? The ground just moved. The walls are breathing. We need to get out while we can." "Shut up," Eric growled, grabbing Milo's arm. "We didn't come this far to run back like scared children. Scared children have the right idea." Milo shot back, wrenching his arm free. He gestured toward the tunnel they had entered through. "You go ahead, Eric. I'm done. I'm going back." Before Eric could respond, a sound stopped them all cold. A deep inhalation, so loud and so prolonged that it made the air vibrate. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the cave itself were drawing breath. Hannah whimpered, What is that?" No one answered. The sound of the inhale ended, replaced by a soft, guttural exhale that sent a wave of bitter cold air rushing past them. Then came the first scream. "Katia!" Eric spun around, only to see her slumped against the wall, clutching her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. "Something's wrong," she rasped, her voice breaking. It's inside my head." "What are you talking about?" Eric demanded, crouching beside her. "The whispers," Katia said, her fingers digging into her temples. "They're not just sounds. They're their thoughts." She looked up at him, her expression panicked. "It's like it knows me. Like it's in me." Okay, Eric said, trying to steady her. "Breathe. Focus. You're just exhausted. Everyone's on edge." He looked over his shoulder at Milo. "Help me get her up." But Milo wasn't looking at Eric or Katia. His eyes were fixed on the tunnel behind them. "Hannah," Milo said, his voice shaking. "Where's Hannah?" They all turned, and their headlamps swept the chamber. Hannah was gone. "Hannah!" Eric shouted, his voice echoing into the endless darkness. The only reply was a faint laugh, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. "She was right here," Milo said, his hands trembling. "We need to find her," Eric snapped, pulling Katia to her feet. She swayed but managed to stay upright. "Are you insane?" Milo hissed. "She's gone, and whatever this place is, whatever it's doing to us, wants us to follow her. I'm not leaving anyone behind," Eric said, his jaw set. He adjusted his headlamp and began walking toward a narrower passageway on the far side of the chamber. She couldn't have gone far. Katia hesitated, glancing at Milo, then back at Eric. "He's right, Eric. Something about this place, it's alive. It's not natural. None of this is natural," Eric barked. "But we're not leaving her. Now move." Grudgingly, Milo and Katia followed Eric as he entered the passageway. The air grew colder, the walls tighter. It felt as though the cave were closing in around them. "Do you hear that?" Milo whispered after a few minutes. "No," Eric said, his voice tense. "What do you hear?" Milo swallowed hard. "Footsteps. Behind us." Eric's headlamp swung back, illuminating the empty tunnel behind them. "There's nothing there," Eric said firmly, though his hand tightened on his flashlight. But Milo wasn't convinced. He began walking faster, keeping close to Eric and Katia. As they continued, the whispers grew louder, and with them came images, flickering shadows along the walls that mimicked human forms. Eric stopped abruptly as they emerged into another chamber. This one was smaller than the last but more disturbing. The floor was covered in faintly glowing symbols, pulsing with a dull, sickly green light. At the center of the room stood an altar carved from black stone. Dried streaks of something dark and rust-colored ran down its sides. "Oh no," Katia whispered, staring at the altar. This wasn't on any of the maps. Milo's breathing quickened as he backed away. "This is a trap. This whole place is a goddamn trap." "Hannah," Eric called, ignoring Milo. "Are you here?" His voice was met with silence. then a faint rustling. A figure stepped out from the shadows at the edge of the room. It was Hannah, but her face was different, distant, almost vacant. Her eyes glowed faintly in the green light as she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her tone flat and cold. Eric froze, staring at her. "Hannah, what's going on? Are you okay?" Her lips curved into a chilling smile. "The cave breathes. The cave watches. And you are its offering." Then the chamber shook again, violently, and the altar began to glow. The chamber seemed to come alive as the altar pulsed with an unearthly rhythm, its glow intensifying with each thrum. The air felt electrified, and the whispers escalated into a cacophony that rattled their skulls. "Hannah!" Eric shouted over the noise, but she didn't react. Her body jerked unnaturally, as if she were a marionette tugged by invisible strings. She stepped closer to the altar, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Stay back," Eric commanded, but she ignored him, her glowing eyes locked on the dark stone. Katia gripped his arm. "Eric, we need to get out of here. Now." "No," Eric said, shaking her off. "I'm not leaving her. Then you'll die here," Milo yelled, retreating toward the tunnel they'd come through. As Eric started toward Hannah, the floor trembled violently, and the walls of the chamber seemed to swell and contract like the lungs of a titanic creature. A low, guttural exhalation surged from the depths of the cave, extinguishing their headlamps in an instant. Total darkness enveloped them. "Eric!" Katia's voice was shrill in the blackness. "I'm here!" Eric yelled back, fumbling for his backup flashlight. A dim glow illuminated the room once more, but it wasn't from their lights. The green symbols on the floor now shone brighter, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The altar, pulsing with life, emitted a sound that wasn't a sound at all. It resonated in their bones, a wordless vibration that filled their chests and made breathing almost impossible. Hannah stood motionless, her face eerily calm, her lips moving as if in silent prayer. "We have to stop her," Eric shouted, lunging forward. But as soon as his foot touched the glowing symbols, he was hurled backward, as if by an invisible force. He slammed into the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Katia rushed to him, her hands shaking. "Eric, are you okay?" He coughed violently, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine, but there's some kind of barrier. I can't." Before he could finish, Hannah turned toward them. Her eyes were blank, her expression serene. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Hannah, please," Katia pleaded. "Come back to us." "She's not Hannah anymore," Milo said, his face pale. "Whatever this place is, it's taken her." Hannah's head tilted, as though considering his words. "Taken," she repeated, the word rolling off her tongue with deliberate slowness. Milo backed away, panic in his eyes. "We have to leave. We have to leave right now." Before anyone could respond, the chamber shook again, this time with such ferocity that chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling. A deafening roar filled the space, a sound that was part scream, part groan, and entirely inhuman. Katia grabbed Eric's arm, pulling him to his feet. "He's right. We need to go." "What about Hannah?" Eric demanded, his gaze fixed on the altar. "She's gone," Milo yelled, his voice cracking. "We're next if we stay." As if in response, the glowing symbols on the floor began to shift, their shapes rearranging into something new. The whispers transformed into guttural chants, growing louder and more insistent. Then the walls began to move. They weren't simply shaking. They were contracting, closing in, as if the cave itself were alive and intent on consuming them. "Run!" Katia screamed, dragging Eric toward the tunnel. Milo didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the passageway, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. Katia and Eric followed, the oppressive heat of the chamber giving way to a bitter cold as they raced deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels. The whispers pursued them, now accompanied by distant footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. Shadows flitted along the walls, too fast and too large to be cast by their lights. "What the hell is happening?" Milo gasped as they ran. "It's the cave," Katia said, her voice trembling. "It's alive. It's feeding off us." Ahead, the tunnel forked into two paths. Milo skidded to a stop, looking frantically between them. "Which way?" Eric caught up, his chest heaving. "Left," he said without hesitation. "How do you know?" Milo snapped. "I don't," Eric admitted, grabbing Milo's shoulder. "But standing here isn't an option. Move." Reluctantly, Milo followed Eric and Katia down the left tunnel. The air grew colder with each step, their breath forming clouds that vanished almost instantly. Behind them, the whispers escalated into a maddening chorus, the sound of countless voices overlapping, screaming, laughing, crying. "Don't look back," Eric ordered, his voice hard. But Milo couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. The tunnel behind them was collapsing, but not with rock or debris. Darkness itself surged forward like a living wave, swallowing everything in its path. "Oh, God," Milo whispered, his legs trembling. "Milo, move!" Katia screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. The three of them sprinted down the tunnel, the crushing darkness nipping at their heels. Ahead, a faint light appeared, flickering like a dying flame. "There!" Eric shouted, his voice raw with desperation. They stumbled toward it, their lungs burning, their legs screaming for relief. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing another chamber. This one smaller and less elaborate, with no symbols or altars in sight. They collapsed inside, gasping for air as the tunnel behind them sealed itself in utter blackness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a familiar voice whispered, "You shouldn't have run." It was Hannah's voice, but it wasn't Hannah, and the light in the chamber began to dim. The faint light in the chamber flickered erratically, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Eric, Katia, and Milo stood frozen, their bodies trembling as the familiar, yet alien voice echoed around them. "You shouldn't have run." "Hannah," Eric called, his voice raw with desperation. "If you're there, answer me." There was no response. Instead, the shadows on the walls began to shift, merging into a single towering figure that loomed over them, its form fluid and unnatural. Two hollow voids stared back at them, where eyes should have been. "No," Milo whispered, backing away. "No, no way. This isn't real." The figure moved, its elongated limbs stretching toward them like liquid smoke. Each movement brought an unnatural crackling sound, as if the air itself protested its existence. "Stay back," Eric shouted, raising his flashlight like a weapon. The beam passed through the figure, but it didn't falter. Katia grabbed Eric's arm. "It's not physical," she said, her voice shaking. It's the cave." "The cave?" Milo barked, his voice shrill with panic. "What the hell does that mean?" Katia shook her head, her eyes darting between the figure and the walls that seemed to pulse with each breath they took. "It's alive. It's a consciousness. It's using us." The figure spoke again, its voice layered with countless tones and cadences. "You came unbidden. You disturbed the silence. You are," it paused, tilting its head unnaturally. "Sacrifices." "No, we're not," Eric roared, stepping forward. "We're leaving. You can't stop us." The figure's form flickered, its edges blurring as it leaned closer. "You cannot leave." The chamber shuddered violently, and the ground beneath their feet began to crack. From the fissures seeped a thick, black mist that clung to their boots like tar. Milo screamed and scrambled backward, his back hitting the wall. "I told you, we should have left." Katia's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to focus. It's trying to break us down, separate us." But it was too late. The shadows around the figure stretched outward, enveloping Milo in an instant. His flashlight fell to the ground, spinning wildly as his screams filled the chamber. "Milo!" Eric shouted, rushing toward the darkness. But it was impenetrable, swallowing the light like a black hole. Katia yanked him back. "You can't help him. You'll get pulled in too." Milo's screams abruptly ceased, leaving an oppressive silence that made Eric's chest tighten. The black mist dissipated, and Milo was gone. "No," Eric whispered, staring at the empty space where his friend had stood moments ago. "This is my fault. We don't have time for this." Katia snapped, gripping his shoulders. "If we don't keep moving, we're next." The figure's form began to dissolve, its shadows retreating into the walls. But its voice lingered, echoing in their minds. "You cannot escape what has already begun." "Come on," Katia urged, pulling Eric toward the only visible exit, a narrow tunnel on the far side of the chamber. They stumbled into the passageway, their breaths ragged. The tunnel twisted sharply, its walls growing rougher and narrower with each step. The hissing sound returned, louder and more erratic, as if the cave were gasping for air. Eric stopped suddenly, clutching his chest. "I can't. It's too much. I can't breathe." Katia turned, her face pale. She grabbed his arm, trying to steady him. "It's the cave. It's compressing the air, trying to suffocate us." The walls seemed to press closer, their surfaces slick with moisture that smelled of iron and decay. The light from Katia's headlamp flickered, casting fragmented beams that danced like frantic ghosts. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice cracking. "If we stop now, we're dead." Eric nodded weakly, forcing himself to move. As they rounded a corner, the tunnel opened into another chamber, a vast, echoing void that seemed impossibly large compared to the cramped passage they had just emerged from. The air here was thick and oppressive, making each breath a laborious effort. In the center of the chamber stood another altar, larger and more grotesque than the first. Strange objects were scattered around it. Bones, trinkets, fragments of pottery, all arranged in a grotesque tableau. Eric and Katia stopped, their eyes drawn to the far side of the room. There, standing motionless, was Hannah. "Hannah," Eric called, his voice hoarse. She didn't move. Her head was bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Katia grabbed Eric's arm, holding him back. "Wait, look at her feet." He followed her gaze. The ground beneath Hannah was marked with intricate patterns, glowing faintly in a sickly red hue. The patterns extended outward, forming a web-like design that pulsed in rhythm with the hissing sound that surrounded them. "It's a trap," Katia whispered. Before Eric could respond, Hannah's head snapped up. Her eyes were no longer blank. They burned with a fierce, unnatural light. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that was both hers and not hers. "You cannot run from the breath of the hollow. You belong to it now." The patterns on the floor flared brightly, and the room trembled. The hissing sound grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar. The walls began to contract, the chamber closing in around them. "Move!" Katia screamed, pulling Eric back toward the tunnel. But as they turned, the entrance sealed itself, leaving them trapped with the hollow's wrath. The chamber roared with a life of its own, the walls vibrating like the sides of a massive throat. Eric and Katia pressed their backs against the sealed tunnel entrance, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as the glowing patterns beneath Hannah's feet pulsed faster. "This can't be it," Katia muttered, her voice trembling. "There has to be a way out." Eric's flashlight flickered weakly, casting fractured shadows across the grotesque altar. "We don't run from this," he said, his jaw set. "Whatever this thing is, it's playing with us." "Playing with us?" Katia hissed, her voice sharp with panic. "It's killing us, Eric." The roaring quieted, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to synchronize with their heartbeats. Hannah took a step forward, the red glow at her feet rippling outward like liquid fire. "You came seeking the truth," she said, her voice layered with a multitude of tones, some human, some not. "The hollow will grant it if you pay the price." Katia shook her head vehemently. "No, no deals, no price. We're leaving." Hannah tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing. "There is no leaving. You are within the breath. You are the breath." Eric stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Hannah, whatever this thing is, you can fight it. You don't belong to it. We're going to get you out of here." Hannah's lips curled into a cold, predatory smile. "You misunderstand. I am already free." Before Eric could react, the glowing web of symbols surged toward him, stopping just short of his boots. He stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Katia grabbed him by the arm. "It's baiting us, Eric. Don't let it pull you in." Eric's face twisted in frustration. "We can't just stand here. Milo's gone, and now Hannah. She's not Hannah anymore." Katia snapped, her voice harsh. "We have to focus. If we're going to survive, we can't keep playing this thing's game." The chamber trembled again, and the air grew impossibly thick, like the pressure before a storm. The glow from the patterns on the floor began to spread, crawling up the walls and twisting into unfamiliar shapes. Katia squinted at the glowing designs, her breath catching. "These symbols, they're changing." "What do you mean?" Eric asked, his eyes darting between her and the encroaching light. "They weren't here before. They're shifting, like they're reacting to us." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think it's alive." "Yeah. No kidding, mater." "No, I mean these patterns," Katia said, her voice trembling with both fear and awe. "They're not just decorations or rituals. They're pathways. They're feeding it." The glowing patterns reached the altar, and a deep, guttural sound reverberated through the chamber. The air itself seemed to throb in unison with the sound. Hannah took another step forward, her movements unnervingly fluid. "The hollow is patient," she said, her voice soft yet piercing. "But it will not wait forever." Eric's fists clenched at his sides. "What does it want from us?" Hannah's head tilted back, and for a moment, her mouth moved soundlessly. Then her gaze snapped back to them, her eyes burning brighter. "It wants what all things want: to grow, to endure, to consume." "Consume what?" Katia asked, though she already knew the answer. "You," Hannah replied simply, her lips curling into a faint smile. Katia turned to Eric, her voice low and urgent. "There has to be a way to stop this. The symbols, they're part of the process. If we can disrupt them how?" Eric demanded. "I don't know," Katia admitted, her voice rising. "But we can't just stand here and wait to be swallowed." Before Eric could respond, the glowing lights surged toward them again, forcing them to retreat closer to the sealed tunnel entrance. The roar returned, deafening and all-encompassing, as if the cave itself were howling in rage. "Do something!" Eric shouted over the noise. Katia's eyes darted around the chamber, her mind racing. Her gaze locked onto a jagged piece of rock lying near the altar. Without thinking, she lunged for it, narrowly avoiding the glowing tendrils that lashed out at her. "Katia!" Eric yelled, his heart pounding. She ignored him, clutching the rock tightly as she examined the glowing patterns on the floor. Taking a deep breath, she raised the rock and brought it down with all her strength. The impact shattered part of the glowing web, sending sparks flying. The light dimmed momentarily, and the chamber trembled violently. Hannah screamed, a sound of pure, unearthly fury, and the shadows around her writhed like wounded animals. "It's working!" Katia shouted, raising the rock again. But before she could strike, the glow beneath her feet flared, and she was thrown backward, slamming into the wall with a sickening crack. "Katia!" Eric ran to her side, his heart sinking as he saw blood trickling from her forehead. Hannah's voice rang out, more monstrous than ever. "You cannot destroy what has always been. The hollow consumes all." Eric gritted his teeth, his gaze shifting between the unconscious Katia and the altar. The room pulsed with menace, the whispers rising into a frenzied chant. He knew he was running out of time. "Come on," Eric muttered to himself, his mind racing. "Think, there has to be a way to beat this." The roar grew louder, and the walls began to close in. The cave was alive, and it was hungry. The walls of the chamber convulsed as if alive, their slick surfaces folding inward with every exhalation of the cave. The air was so thick with oppressive energy that Eric felt it press against his chest, making each breath a laborious task. He knelt beside Katia, whose head lolled to one side. Her forehead was smeared with blood, but her chest rose and fell weakly. "Katia," he whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Wake up, please." A guttural laugh echoed through the chamber, sending chills racing down Eric's spine. He turned to see Hannah standing near the altar, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her glowing eyes boring into him. "You cannot save her," she said, her voice layered with discordant tones. "She belongs to the Hollow, as do you." Eric rose slowly, his fists clenched. "I don't care what this place is," he growled. "I'm not letting it take her. I'm not letting it take me." The altar pulsed, its sickly red glow intensifying. Hannah stepped aside, revealing a grotesque object resting atop it. A twisted idol, carved from bone and stone, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols that adorned the chamber. The whispers swelled, their cadence hypnotic, urging Eric forward. "This is your purpose," Hannah said, gesturing to the idol. "The Hollow calls. You must answer." Eric's eyes locked on the idol, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "What does it want from me?" "To endure," Hannah replied, her smile widening. "To take your breath, your life, your very essence, and make it part of itself." Eric shook his head, backing away. "No, no way. I'm not some sacrifice for this thing." But as he stepped back, the chamber quaked violently, and the walls began to close in faster. The glowing symbols on the floor spread like wildfire, crawling up the walls and ceiling, trapping him in a pulsating cocoon of light and sound. "Eric!" The weak voice jolted him from his panic. He turned to see Katia stirring, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented, her gaze struggling to focus on him. "Katia!" Eric said, dropping to his knees beside her. "It's okay. I've got you." She winced, her hand brushing the blood on her forehead. What's happening?" "It's the cave," Eric said, his voice taut. "It's trying to trap us, but we're going to get out of here. Together." Katia's eyes drifted past him, widening in fear. "Eric, behind you." He turned just in time to see Hannah advancing, her movements inhumanly smooth and deliberate. The red glow from the altar cast her face in a demonic light, emphasizing the cruel smile that twisted her features. "Do not resist," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The Hollow has chosen." Eric grabbed the jagged rock Katia had used earlier and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with desperation. Hannah paused, tilting her head. "You think you can harm me? You cannot harm what is eternal." But Eric didn't hesitate. With a guttural cry, he hurled the rock at the altar. It struck the grotesque idol with a sharp crack, sending shards of bone and stone flying. The effect was immediate. The whispers turned to agonized screams, and the chamber convulsed as if in pain. Hannah shrieked, clutching her head as the red glow in her eyes flickered. "You dare!" she roared, her voice distorting into a monstrous growl. The altar shuddered violently, and a plume of black smoke erupted from the shattered idol, swirling around the chamber like a living storm. The walls began to crumble, chunks of rock falling as the cave's breath grew ragged and erratic. "Eric, we have to go!" Katia cried, struggling to her feet. Eric grabbed her arm, supporting her as they stumbled toward the far end of the chamber, where a faint glimmer of light pierced the darkness. The smoke pursued them, its tendrils lashing out like claws, scraping against the walls and floor. As they neared the light, the ground beneath them cracked, opening into a jagged chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. Eric stopped short, his heart pounding as he stared into the abyss. "There's no way across," Katia shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Eric looked back at the swirling smoke, then at the faint light on the other side of the chasm. He gritted his teeth. "We jump." "Are you insane?" Katia yelled. "Do you want to stay here?" Eric shot back, his voice fierce. "On 3. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the ground beneath them gave way. They fell into the darkness. For a moment, Eric felt weightless, the wind roaring past his ears. Then he hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Dazed, he looked around, his headlamp flickering weakly. They were in another chamber, smaller and quieter than the last. The glowing symbols were gone, replaced by smooth, featureless stone. The oppressive hissing had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence. Katia groaned beside him, clutching her ribs. "Are we alive?" "I think so," Eric muttered, helping her sit up. But as he turned his head, his heart sank. The chamber's only exit was blocked by a thick curtain of black smoke, undulating like a living barrier. And from the center of the smoke, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. "You cannot escape," the voice of the hollow intoned, deeper and more menacing than before. "You are already mine." Eric and Katia huddled together, their bodies trembling as the glowing eyes in the smoke drew closer, their light reflecting off the smooth stone walls. The oppressive silence was broken only by the hollow's slow, deliberate breaths, each exhalation rattling in their chests like the prelude to a final blow. "You cannot run from what is inevitable," the hollow's voice intoned, layered with tones both human and inhuman. "You have entered the breath. You are part of it now." Katia clutched Eric's arm, her voice a shaky whisper. "It's toying with us? Trying to break us down? Don't listen to it." But Eric wasn't so sure. His mind raced, torn between survival and the overwhelming despair that this thing could not be defeated. "What do you want from us?" Eric shouted into the smoky void. His voice echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the darkness. The hollow's eyes narrowed, and the smoke around it churned like a living storm. "I want what was promised. You came willingly, bringing your breath, your life, to this place. You are the offering." "We didn't come to offer anything," Eric barked. Katia's grip tightened on his arm. "Eric, maybe this is a ritual. Maybe it was started long before us." Eric glanced at her, his mind racing. "You mean someone else set this thing in motion?" Katia nodded weakly. "The carvings, the symbols, it's all part of a cycle. It's not about us. It's about the cave. It's been waiting, feeding, growing." She hesitated, her eyes filling with fear. "It won't stop unless the cycle is complete." The hollow's laughter echoed around them, filling the chamber with its resonant malice. "The cycle is eternal," it said. "You are but the next breath. Resistance is meaningless." Eric stepped forward, his fists clenched. "If that's true, then why are you still talking? If you're so powerful, why haven't you just taken us?" The hollow's eyes flared, its form shifting as it loomed larger. "Your breath is not yet ripe. Your fear must blossom. Your will must break. Only then will you be consumed." Eric's heart pounded in his chest. The hollow was feeding off their terror, their desperation. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that their fear was its lifeblood. Katia's voice trembled as she spoke. "If fear is what it wants, maybe that's how we stop it. We can't give it what it needs." Eric shook his head. "How do we fight fear in a place like this?" "You don't," the hollow answered, its voice mocking. "Your fear is woven into the breath itself. It is inescapable." But Eric wasn't listening anymore. He turned to Katia, his eyes burning with determination. "We have to try. It's the only way." Katia hesitated, her breath shallow. "What if it doesn't work? What if we—" "Then we're dead anyway," Eric said firmly. "But I'm not going to let this thing control me. Not anymore." He straightened, forcing himself to take slow, deliberate breaths. The oppressive air seemed to push back against him, but he fought it, grounding himself in the rhythm of his heartbeat. The hollow's laughter faltered, replaced by a low growl. "What are you doing?" it demanded, the smoke swirling angrily. Eric met its gaze, his expression hard. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice steady. "You're just a parasite, feeding on fear. Well, you're not getting mine." The chamber trembled, the hollow's form convulsing as its eyes burned brighter. "You cannot deny me!" it roared, the smoke lashing out like claws. Katia took a shaky step forward, her voice rising in defiance. "You're wrong. You don't control us. We control you. This ends now." Together, they stood tall, their fear replaced by a simmering anger, a refusal to give in. The hollow howled in fury, its voice splitting into countless layers, but the tendrils of smoke faltered, retreating slightly. The chamber grew darker, the light from the hollow's eyes dimming as if it were losing strength. The air became lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from their chests. But the hollow wasn't finished. "You think you have one?" It snarled, its form flickering wildly. "The breath is eternal. Even without fear, you cannot escape. You are trapped." Eric glanced at Katia, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We're not dead yet. Let's find out." As the hollow shrank back, its smoke dissipating, the wall behind it began to crack, revealing a faint, flickering light. It was dim, but it was enough. "There!" Katia cried, grabbing Eric's hand. They sprinted toward the light, dodging as the hollow lashed out in desperation. The smoke clawed at their legs, but its grip was weaker now, its strength waning. "Run!" Eric shouted, pulling Katia forward as the light grew brighter. The hollow's voice chased after them, a deafening roar of rage and despair. "You cannot escape. You will always belong to the hollow." But they didn't stop. The light enveloped them as they burst through the crack in the wall, the roar of the hollow fading into silence. For a moment, everything was blinding white, and then they were outside. The cold mountain air filled their lungs, sharp and invigorating after the oppressive atmosphere of the cave. Eric and Katia collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for breath. The entrance to the cave loomed behind them, silent and still, its jagged maw framed by frost. Katia looked at Eric, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did we really escape?" Eric didn't answer. He was staring at the cave, his jaw clenched. From deep within, faint and distant, came a single exhalation, the breath of the hollow. The mountain air bit at their exposed skin, but the chill felt like a reprieve compared to the suffocating darkness of the cave. Eric and Katia lay on the jagged ground, catching their breath, the distant exhalation from the cave barely audible over the howling wind. Katia sat up first, wincing as she touched the wound on her forehead. "We made it out," she said, though her voice trembled with disbelief. Eric remained on the ground, his eyes fixed on the cave's entrance. "Did we?" Katia turned to him, her face pale. "What are you talking about? We're outside. We're free." But Eric wasn't convinced. The faint exhale from the cave still reached him, a sound so subtle it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet it reverberated deep in his chest. "It's still here," he muttered. "I can feel it." Katia shivered, glancing at the dark opening of the cave. "Of course it's still there. It's part of the mountain, part of this place. But it didn't stop us, didn't it?" Eric asked, finally sitting up. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. "Milo's gone. Hannah's whatever she is now. And we're still hearing it, Katia. That thing's not done with us." Katia's resolve faltered. The wind carried an unnatural hum, almost imperceptible, but once noticed, it was impossible to ignore. "What if we're still inside?" Eric asked, his voice low. Katia grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite her exhaustion. "Don't do this. Don't let it get into your head again. That's how it wins." Eric pulled his arm free, pacing. "How do we know? How do we know this isn't just another one of its tricks?" Katia hesitated, the doubt creeping in her mind as well. "If this is still the cave," she said carefully, "then the rules haven't changed. It feeds on fear. If we start doubting, it'll pull us back in." Eric stopped, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "What if we're already back in?" "Stop it!" Katia snapped, her voice breaking. "We're out. Look around you. This is real." Her words hung in the air, the silence between them heavy. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, their peaks shrouded in mist. The cave loomed like a wound in the earth, its jagged entrance swallowing the daylight. "We need to leave," Katia said, her tone softer now. "We need to get off this mountain and as far away from this place as possible." Eric nodded reluctantly. "You're right. Let's go." But as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them trembled. It was faint at first, a subtle vibration, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The cave behind them exhaled again, louder this time, and the air around them grew unnaturally cold. Katia froze, her breath visible in the frigid air. "No," she whispered. "It can't." The wind picked up, carrying whispers with it. Faint, disjointed voices that seemed to come from every direction. Eric turned in a slow circle, his eyes wide. "It's following us," he said. A sharp crack split the air, and they turned to see the ground near the cave's entrance splitting open. The fissure spread quickly, jagged lines tearing through the earth as if the mountain itself were coming apart. From the cracks seeped a black mist, thick and writhing like the smoke from the altar. Katia grabbed Eric's hand. "Run!" They bolted down the rocky slope, their footing uncertain as the ground quaked beneath them. The mist poured from the cave, coalescing into a massive, undulating form that loomed over the mountainside. The whispers grew louder, forming words now, though they were still fragmented and alien. Part of the breath, "You cannot flee." Eric glanced over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The mist had taken shape, its amorphous form towering above them. Two hollow voids glowed where eyes should have been, staring down at them with an unnatural intelligence. "Keep moving," Katia shouted, yanking him forward. The slope steepened, and loose rocks shifted beneath their feet. Eric stumbled but managed to stay upright, his legs burning as they sprinted toward a distant ridge. "We have to make it to the trees," Katia yelled, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind. But the mist moved faster, slithering across the ground like a living tide. It was closing the distance, its tendrils lashing out like whips. One struck a boulder nearby, shattering it into fragments. "We're not going to make it," Eric shouted, his panic rising. "Yes, we will," Katia yelled back, her determination fierce. "We have to." They reached the ridge, the forest tantalizingly close, when the ground beneath them cracked open. Eric leapt forward, grabbing onto a protruding rock as the edge crumbled beneath him. "Eric!" Katia screamed, reaching for him. He gritted his teeth, his fingers digging into the stone as the mist surged closer. "Go," he shouted. "I'll catch up. I'm not leaving you," Katia cried, her hand grasping his wrist. The mist loomed above them, its hollow eyes fixed on Eric. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the air around them seemed to compress, choking off their breaths. "You cannot escape the hollow," the voice intoned. "You are mine." Eric's grip faltered, his strength waning as the pressure mounted. The glowing eyes of the mist seemed to burn into him, pulling him closer. But Katia refused to let go. Her grip tightened, and she leaned forward, her voice fierce. "You don't own us." The words echoed unnaturally, and for a moment, the mist hesitated, its form flickering. The pressure lifted slightly, and Eric managed to pull himself up with Katia's help. Together, they scrambled over the ridge and plunged into the forest, the trees closing around them like a protective shroud. Behind them, the mist writhed at the edge of the trees, its glowing eyes burning with fury. But it did not follow. The whispers faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Eric collapsed against a tree, his chest heaving. "Why didn't it follow?" Katia leaned against him, her face pale but determined. "It's bound to the cave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It can't leave." They sat in silence, the weight of their escape sinking in. But in the distance, faint and almost imperceptible, they heard it again. The hollow exhaled. The forest closed around them, the skeletal trees swaying gently in the wind. Eric and Katia huddled beneath the thick canopy, their breaths ragged, their bodies aching. The rhythmic pulse of the hollow's exhalations faded into the distance, but its presence lingered in the air, a weight they couldn't shake. "We can't stay here," Eric said finally, his voice hoarse. "We have to keep moving." Katia nodded, though her face betrayed her exhaustion. "We need to find a way off this mountain. The village, the people that might know something. Anything to help us understand what just happened." Eric hesitated, his eyes scanning the dense forest. "Do you think they knew? The villagers? About the cave?" Katia frowned, recalling the warnings they had brushed aside. "They tried to tell us. They called it Sighing Hollow, said it was cursed." Her voice dropped. "We didn't listen." Eric rubbed his hands over his face, trying to push back the overwhelming guilt. "Milo, Hannah, I should have known. I should have stopped this before it got out of control." "It wasn't your fault," Katia said firmly, gripping his arm. This thing, it's ancient. It's bigger than us. Blaming yourself won't bring them back. Eric nodded, though his eyes remained distant. Let's move. We'll figure this out later. The forest floor was uneven, strewn with roots and rocks that made progress slow and painful. The light dimmed as heavy clouds rolled in, casting the world in shades of gray. After hours of trekking, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood a crude wooden shrine, weathered and overgrown with moss. Symbols carved into the wood were faint but unmistakable, spirals and jagged patterns, eerily similar to the ones they had seen in the cave. Looks familiar, doesn't it? Katia said grimly, kneeling to examine the carvings. Eric's jaw tightened as he studied the shrine. It's connected. The villagers must have built this, maybe to keep the hollow contained. Katia traced her fingers over the carvings, her brow furrowed. Or to appease it. Look here, these symbols represent offerings. Eric's heart sank. So the villagers knew. They've been feeding it, sacrificing to it. Katia nodded, her face pale. It's how the hollow survives. It needs people to complete the cycle, to keep the breath flowing. She paused, her voice trembling. That's why it let us go. We're part of the cycle now. Eric felt a cold dread settle over him. What are you saying? Katia stood, her eyes dark with realization. We're marked. It won't stop until it gets what it wants. If we don't do something, this thing will keep coming after us. Or worse, it'll go after someone else. Eric clenched his fists, his anger rising. No, I'm not letting it win. There has to be a way to break the cycle. Katia looked at him, her expression torn. Breaking the cycle might mean stopping it from breathing altogether. Destroying it. Then we destroy it, Eric said, his voice firm. How? Katia asked. We barely made it out alive. We don't even know what it really is. Eric stared at the shrine, his mind racing. The crude structure seemed ancient, but it was clearly maintained. Someone had been here recently, perhaps even the villagers. This isn't just some cursed cave, he said slowly. It's alive. If it breathes, it can die. Katia's eyes widened. You're serious? You want to go back? Not yet, Eric said, his gaze hard. First, we figure out how to stop it. Then we end this. The sound of snapping branches interrupted their conversation, and they both turned sharply, their hearts pounding. Did you hear that? Katia whispered. Eric nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the jagged rock he had kept since the cave. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, too fast and too large to be human. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the trees like a phantom wind. No, Katia breathed, backing away. It can't be. The mist seeped into the clearing, dark and malevolent, pooling around the base of the shrine. Two hollow eyes emerged from its depths, glowing faintly. It's here, Eric said, his voice tight with fear. The hollow's voice resonated in the clearing, deeper and more menacing than before. You cannot break the breath. You are already mine. Eric stepped in front of Katia, holding the rock like a weapon. We're not afraid of you, he said, though his voice wavered. The hollow laughed, a sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Your fear is irrelevant. The cycle continues, as it always has. The mist surged forward, and Eric and Katia scrambled to retreat, but the hollow didn't attack. Instead, it circled the shrine, its tendrils weaving through the carvings. What's it doing? Katia whispered, her voice trembling. It's protecting it, Eric realized. The shrine, it's part of the cycle. The hollow's eyes flared, its voice thunderous. You cannot sever what is eternal. The breath is life. The breath is all. Eric's mind raced as the mist thickened around the shrine, forming a barrier. The whispers grew louder, pressing against his thoughts like a vice. Then he saw it. A small, glowing object nestled at the base of the shrine, half buried in the moss. It pulsed faintly, its light rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The source, Eric murmured. Katia followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing. If we destroy that, we end this, Eric finished. But the hollow loomed closer, its tendrils lashing out, blocking their path. We only get one shot, Eric said, gripping the rock tightly. Katia nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Let's make it count. The hollow roared, its voice shaking the forest as Eric and Katia charged toward the shrine. The hollow's roar filled the clearing, shaking the ground as Eric and Katia charged toward the shrine. The mist coiled like a living serpent, its tendrils lashing out to block their path. Eric ducked as one narrowly missed his head, the force of it splintering a tree behind him. Go for the source, Eric shouted, gesturing toward the glowing object nestled at the base of the shrine. Katia nodded, her face pale but resolute. She darted to the side, trying to outmaneuver the mist, while Eric swung the jagged rock in his hand, striking at the tendrils as they lashed toward him. You cannot sever the breath, the hollow's voice thundered, reverberating in their bones. You are mine! Eric's heart pounded as he fought to keep the tendrils at bay, his mind racing with desperation. He glanced at Katia, who was crawling toward the shrine, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing the hollow's attention. I'll distract it, Eric shouted, throwing the rock toward the mist. It sailed through the air and struck the glowing void of one of the hollow's eyes. The hollow roared in fury, its form convulsing as the mist thickened around Eric. Tendrils whipped toward him, one striking his leg and sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his knees, glaring defiantly at the towering shadow. You can't have us, he growled. Not now. Not ever. The hollow loomed over him, its hollow eyes burning with rage. Your defiance is meaningless, it hissed. The breath cannot be undone. But Eric didn't care about its threats. All he needed was more time. Katia reached the shrine, her hands trembling as she dug into the moss, uncovering the glowing object. It was small and smooth, shaped like a heart carved from stone, but it pulsed with a sickly, organic rhythm. This is it, she whispered to herself, her fingers tightening around the object. The hollow sensed her intent and turned, its tendrils surging toward her like a tidal wave. No, it bellowed. You will not destroy the breath. Katia, do it now, Eric shouted, scrambling to his feet despite the searing pain in his leg. Katia stood, the pulsing object clutched in her hands. She hesitated for a split second, the whispers of the hollow clawing at her mind, filling her with doubt. Destroy it, Eric screamed, with a cry of defiance. Katia raised the glowing heart above her head and brought it down with all her strength. The object shattered against the edge of the shrine, sending shards of light and darkness spiraling into the air. The effect was immediate. The hollow let out a deafening, otherworldly scream, its form dissolving into a chaotic swirl of mist and shadow. The glowing tendrils writhed wildly before disintegrating, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The ground trembled violently, and the shrine collapsed in on itself, consumed by the same black mist that had once surrounded it. The forest fell silent, the echoes of the hollow's scream fading into nothingness. Eric stumbled toward Katia, who stood motionless amidst the ruins of the shrine. Her hands were shaking, her face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat. You did it, Eric said, his voice hoarse. You stopped it. Katia turned to him, her eyes wide and unfocused. I think it's gone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Let's get out of here. For real this time. They began their descent down the mountain, the eerie silence of the forest broken only by the sound of their footsteps and labored breathing. The air felt lighter now, freer, as if the mountain itself had been released from a centuries-old curse. But as they reached the base of the mountain, Eric paused, his gaze drawn back to the distant cave. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice tinged with unease. Katia froze, straining to listen. For a moment, there was only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Then, faint and almost imperceptible, came the sound of a breath. Katia shook her head vehemently. No, it's gone. We ended it. We broke the cycle. Eric didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the cave, its jagged entrance barely visible against the rocky mountainside. The faint exhalation faded into silence, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that it was only biding its time. "We need to warn the village," he said finally, "and anyone else who comes near this place." Katia nodded, though her face betrayed her lingering fear. "If it's still there, if it comes back, we'll stop it again," Eric said, his voice firm. "No matter what it takes." They turned away from the mountain, their steps heavy but determined. Behind them, in the depths of the cave, the hollow waited, and in the silence it began to breathe,